The morning of December 7th, 1941, broke over Pearl Harbor with deceptive calm. By 7:55 a.m., that calm shattered into fire and smoke as Japanese carrier aircraft screamed across Oahu's skies. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the attack, stood aboard the battleship Nagato, thousands of miles away, receiving reports of the strike's devastating success. 8 American battleships struck. Nearly 200 aircraft destroyed on the ground, over 2,400 Americans dead. To Tokyo, it seemed a flawless victory, a crippling blow that would buy Japan the time it needed to secure the Pacific and force the United States into a negotiated peace. But Yamamoto did not celebrate. He had studied at Harvard. He had walked the streets of American industrial cities. He had seen the smokestacks of Pittsburgh and the assembly lines of Detroit. And in the euphoria that swept through Imperial headquarters, he issued a warning that would be ignored, dismissed, and ultimately proven prophetic. I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. The Japanese naval staff did not share his concern. In early 1942, Japan stood at the apex of its power. Its empire stretched from the frozen coasts of the Aleutians to the jungles of Burma, from the coral atolls of the Central Pacific to the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. The Imperial Japanese Navy commanded the largest carrier fleet in the world, 10 fleet carriers and several light carriers, veterans of China, Pearl Harbor, and the sweeping conquests across Southeast Asia. Japanese admirals looked at American industrial capacity with a mixture of contempt and disbelief. Yes, America was large. Yes, it was wealthy. But wealth did not equal will. Industry did not equal warrior spirit. The United States, they believed, was a nation of soft businessmen and Hollywood actors, a country that could not endure the sacrifices required for a long Pacific war. American shipyards? Slow, bureaucratic, distracted by labor strikes and democratic inefficiency. The notion that the United States could outbuild Japan, a disciplined, militarized empire that had prepared for this war for over a decade, seemed laughable. In the wardrooms of Japanese carriers, over cups of tea and sake, officers dismissed American industrial threats with wry smiles. One captain aboard the Shokaku reportedly joked that by the time America finished building a single new carrier, Japan would have already won the war. Another remarked that American shipyards were probably still drawing blueprints, while Japanese flat-tops prowled the Pacific unchallenged. There was a cultural arrogance embedded in this dismissal, a belief that the samurai spirit, the Bushido code, the divine favor of the emperor, would overcome mere material advantage. Japan had sunk the Prince of Wales and Repulse, humiliated the British at Singapore, and dominated the Coral Sea and Indian Ocean. What could America, a nation humiliated at Pearl Harbor, driven from the Philippines, losing ground at every turn, possibly do to reverse the tide? But 6,000 miles east, in the sprawling shipyards of Newport News, Virginia, Brooklyn, New York, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Norfolk, Virginia, a transformation was already underway. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was methodical, relentless, and unstoppable. In Washington, D.C., within weeks of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Congress had authorized an expansion of the Navy unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Essex-Class aircraft carrier program, initially conceived in 1939 as a modest replacement for aging carriers, was suddenly turbocharged into a production miracle. The goal was audacious. Build not 1 or 2 carriers, but dozens. Fast, modern, heavily armed floating airfields capable of projecting American air power across the entire Pacific theater. Naval architects worked around the clock, refining blueprints, standardizing components, streamlining construction. The Essex-Class design was 872 feet long, displaced over 27,000 tons, and could carry up to 90 aircraft. It featured armored flight decks, advanced radar systems, and anti-aircraft batteries that could swat enemy planes from the sky. More importantly, it was designed for mass production. American shipyards did not build carriers the way Japan did, individually, Artistically, with each vessel a unique masterpiece requiring years of craftsmanship. They built them the way Henry Ford built cars. Assembly line precision, interchangeable parts, prefabricated sections welded together in record time. Welders, riveters, electricians and painters, many of them women who had never set foot in a shipyard before the war, flooded into the yards by the tens of thousands. Rosie the Riveter was not a propaganda myth. She was a statistical reality. By 1943, nearly 40% of shipyard workers were women. They worked double shifts through winter cold and summer heat, driven by a sense of national purpose that Japanese admirals could not fathom. The first Essex-Class carrier, USS Essex CV-9, was laid down in April 1941, launched in July 1942, and commissioned in December 1942, just 1 year after Pearl Harbor. That alone was impressive, but it was only the beginning. In 1943, the assembly lines roared to life. USS Yorktown, a CV-10, Intrepid, CV-11, Hornet, CV-12, Franklin, a CV-13, Ticonderoga, CV-14, Randolph, CV-15, Lexington, CV-16, Bunker Hill, CV-17, Wasp, CV-18, one after another. These steel giants slid down the ways, christened with champagne, and steamed toward the Pacific. Each one took roughly 15 to 18 months from keel laying to commissioning, a pace that stunned even American naval planners. By late 1943, Japanese intelligence began receiving troubling reports. American carrier sightings were increasing. New task forces were forming. Radio intercepts suggested that the U.S. Navy was no longer retreating, no longer playing defense. It was massing for an offensive. But even then, Japanese admirals underestimated the scale. They assumed the Americans had perhaps rebuilt 3 or 4 carriers to replace losses at Coral Sea, Midway, and the Eastern Solomons. The idea that the United States was producing carriers faster than Japan could sink them, that American shipyards were outpacing Japanese torpedoes, seemed impossible. Then came the autumn of 1943. Operation Galvanic, the assault on the Gilbert Islands, launched in November with a carrier task force unlike anything the Pacific had ever seen. 6 fleet carriers, 5 light carriers, and hundreds of escort vessels converged on Tarawa and Makin. Japanese defenders on those bloodied coral atolls looked up to see the sky darkened by American aircraft. Hellcats, Avengers, Dauntlesses, wave after wave, hour after hour. The air raids did not stop. The carriers did not withdraw. They loitered offshore, untouchable, launching strike after strike with industrial precision. For the first time, Japanese commanders realized they were not facing a wounded enemy limping back into the fight. They were facing a machine, a vast, impersonal, unstoppable industrial machine that had finally reached operational tempo. In early 1944, Admiral Manishi Koga, commander of the combined fleet, reviewed intelligence reports in his headquarters at Truk. The numbers were staggering. American carrier strength was not 3 or 4. It was 12, 15, 20. The reports kept climbing. Koga, like Yamamoto before him, had spent time in the United States. He knew what American industry was capable of, but even he struggled to believe the figures. He ordered confirmation. His staff complied. The confirmations came back worse. Not only were the Americans deploying more carriers than expected, they were better carriers, faster, more heavily armed, equipped with advanced radar that could detect Japanese aircraft at ranges Japanese technology could not match. American fighter planes, the new Grumman F-6F Hellcat, were superior to the Zero in speed, firepower, and durability. American pilots, trained in vast programs back in Florida, Texas, and California, were replacing losses faster than Japan could train new aviators. The qualitative and quantitative advantage was shifting, and shifting fast. By the spring of 1944, the Great Central Pacific Offensive was in full swing. Operation Flintlock seized the Marshall Islands. Operation Hailstone, the devastating carrier raid on Truk in February 1944, obliterated Japanese naval air power in one brutal 2-day strike. Over 250 Japanese aircraft destroyed, dozens of cargo ships and warships sunk. Druk, once considered the Gibraltar of the Pacific, was reduced to a burning graveyard. And still, the American carriers kept coming. USS Enterprise, the legendary Big E, was no longer alone. She was joined by Essex, Intrepid, Yorktown, Lexington, Bunker Hill, Wasp, Hornet, Hancock, Bennington, Bonhomme Richard, Shangri-La, names that became synonymous with American vengeance. Each one carried a full air group. Each one represented thousands of workers, millions of man-hours, billions of dollars. Each one was a floating testament to the industrial supremacy that Japanese admirals had dismissed as fantasy. In June 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea became the crucible that shattered any remaining Japanese illusions. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa led the Japanese mobile fleet into battle with 9 carriers and over 400 aircraft, still a formidable force on paper. Opposing him was Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58, 15 American carriers, over 900 aircraft, and a screen of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers bristling with radar-guided anti-aircraft fire. The battle was not close. It was a massacre. On June 19th, Japanese aircraft launched in wave after wave, only to be intercepted by swarms of Hellcats guided to their targets by shipboard radar. American pilots, better trained and better equipped, shot down Japanese planes by the dozen. By the end of the day, Japan had lost over 300 carrier aircraft and 3 fleet carriers, Taiho, Shokaku, and Hyo, in what American aviators mockingly dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Ozawa limped back to Japan with a shattered fleet. Japanese naval aviation never recovered. The age of the samurai carrier pilot died over the Philippine Sea, shot down not by superior spirit or courage, but by superior training, superior technology, and superior numbers. And still, the American carriers kept coming. By the autumn of 1944, the U.S. Navy's Fast Carrier Task Force, redesignated Task Force 38 under Admiral William Bull Halsey, was the most powerful naval striking force ever assembled in human history. Over 20 fleet and light carriers, supported by battleships that had been raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor, refitted and returned to combat. These task forces roamed the Pacific like armored gods, launching airstrikes at will, obliterating Japanese airfields, sinking cargo convoys, and systematically dismantling the infrastructure of the Japanese Empire. At Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history, Japanese forces attempted one final desperate gambit to destroy the American invasion fleet. They failed. American carriers launched strike after strike, sinking the super battleship Musashi, crippling multiple cruisers and annihilating Japanese air power. The Battle of Leyte Gulf marked the effective end of the Imperial Japanese Navy as a fighting force. By early 1945, Japan had no operational fleet carriers left. The shipyards that had once built Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, the proud flat tops of the Kido Butai, were silent, bombed into ruin or starved of raw materials. Japan's industrial base, never a match for America's, had collapsed under the weight of blockade, bombing, and attrition. Meanwhile, American shipyards continued their relentless rhythm. USS Lake Champlain, CV-39, Tarawa, CV-40, Valley Forge, CV-45, Philippine Sea, CV-47. New carriers were still being commissioned, even as the war entered its final months. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the United States had commissioned 24 Essex-Class fleet carriers, with more under construction. 17 of them saw active combat in World War II. Together, they represented over 600,000 tons of steel, over 2,000 aircraft, and the labor of hundreds of thousands of American workers who had built them in less than 4 years. The symbolic object of this story is not a weapon. It is a hull number. CV-9, CV-10, CV-11, each one a sequential stamp, a bureaucratic designation that told a deeper story, that American industrial power was not chaotic or improvised, but systematic, planned, and executed with ruthless efficiency. Every Essex-Class carrier was nearly identical. Parts were interchangeable. Crews could transfer from one ship to another with minimal retraining. Maintenance protocols were standardized. This was not artistry. It was engineering. It was the application of industrial principles to warfare on a scale the world had never seen, and it worked. Japanese admirals, standing in the ruins of their empire in August 1945, could no longer laugh. They could no longer dismiss. They could only stare at the rows of American carriers anchored in Tokyo Bay and understand, finally, what Yamamoto had tried to tell them 4 years earlier. The transformation of American naval power between 1941 and 1945 was not miraculous. It was the inevitable result of harnessing the productive capacity of a free, industrialized democracy to a singular purpose. Japanese admirals had dismissed American shipyards because they could not imagine a nation that valued efficiency over tradition, innovation over ritual, and speed over perfection. They assumed that democracy was weakness, that capitalism was decadence, that a diverse, multi-ethnic society could not sustain the discipline required for total war. They were wrong on every count. The 50-plus carriers, Essex-Class fleet carriers, Independence-Class light carriers, and dozens of escort carriers that darkened the Pacific between 1943 and 1945 were not just ships. They were arguments. They were floating refutations of fascist ideology, proof that free people, given purpose and leadership, could outproduce, outfight, and outlast any totalitarian regime. There is a photograph taken in August 1945 of Tokyo Bay during the surrender ceremony. In the foreground, Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur stand on the deck of USS Missouri, BB-63, accepting Japan's unconditional surrender. In the background, stretching to the horizon, is the greatest naval armada ever assembled. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and carriers, dozens of carriers, their flight decks empty, their aircraft silent, but their presence unmistakable. The photograph is in black and white, but anyone who studies it can feel the weight of what it represents. Not just victory, not just military triumph, but the vindication of a system, a society, and a people who had been underestimated, attacked, and written off, and who had responded with overwhelming, undeniable industrial fury. Japanese Admiral Sumu Toyota, who had assumed command of the combined fleet after Koga's death, reportedly said in his post-war interrogation that Japan's greatest miscalculation was not Pearl Harbor, not Midway, not even the decision to go to war. It was the belief that American shipyards could be outpaced, that American workers could be outlasted, that American resolve could be broken. He called it our fatal arrogance. In the years after the war, Japanese naval officers who survived would tell their children and grandchildren about the day they first saw an American carrier task force on the horizon. They described the sight not with bitterness, but with something close to awe. One destroyer captain interviewed in the 1970s said, "We thought we were fighting a nation. We were fighting a continent. We thought we were facing sailors. We were facing factories." The Essex-Class carriers served long after World War II. Many were modernized, equipped with angled flight decks and steam catapults, and fought in Korea, Vietnam, and the Cold War. USS Lexington, the CV-16, served as a training carrier until 1991, nearly 50 years of active service. Several were preserved as museum ships: Intrepid in New York, Yorktown in Charleston, Hornet in Alameda. Walk their decks today, and you can still feel the echoes of 1943, 1944, 1945, the roar of radial engines, the smell of aviation fuel, the thunder of catapults launching Hellcats into dawn skies. These ships are not just relics. They are monuments to the victory of industrialized democracy over militarized fascism. They are proof that freedom, when threatened, does not collapse into chaos. It organizes, it builds, it overwhelms. In the end, the 50 Essex-Class and light carriers that darkened the Pacific were not a surprise. They were a promise kept, a promise made by Franklin Roosevelt when he called for the United States to become the arsenal of democracy, a promise made by millions of American workers who traded their peacetime lives for war work. A promise made by sailors and aviators who crewed those ships, launched from those decks, and fought from those carriers across 10,000 miles of ocean. Japanese admirals had dismissed that promise as bluster, as propaganda, as wishful thinking. They learned, too late, that American promises once made are built in steel. And once built, they do not stop. They do not falter. They do not retreat. They advance relentlessly until the job is done. The sleeping giant had awakened, and the resolve with which it was filled was measured not in words, but in carriers. 50 of them, each one a rebuke, each one a reckoning, each one a reminder that those who underestimate the will of a free people do so at their peril.